What if the biggest secret of a deadly crime family wasn't buried in a reinforced vault, but drawn in a careless smear of chocolate sauce on a dessert plate? 3 6-year-old boys, heirs to the Rocco syndicate, hadn't spoken a single word since the night their mother was brutally murdered. Doctors called it trauma-induced mutism. The city's most feared boss, Sebastian Rocco, had exhausted every specialist in the country to no avail. But on a rainy Tuesday evening, a broke diner waitress named Alice drew a strange, twisted symbol on their plate. What happened next terrified the bodyguards, brought the Mafia boss to his knees, and unraveled a conspiracy that would paint the streets red. The ambient lighting inside Lombardi's Prime was intentionally dim, casting long, expensive shadows across the leather booths and mahogany tables. Located just off Rush Street in Dakota's affluent Gold Coast, it was the kind of establishment where city aldermen dined with union bosses, and where the host stand kept a private list of people who bypassed the reservation book entirely. Alice Jenkins was 24, exhausted and running out of options. She had been working at Lombardi's for 6 months, keeping her head down, her apron clean, and her mouth shut. She knew the unspoken rules of the restaurant. When men in tailored Italian suits came in flanked by larger men with bulging jackets, you filled their water glasses, you didn't make sustained eye contact, and you certainly didn't ask questions. Alice had learned early on that survival in this city meant mastering the art of being invisible. But invisibility was hard to maintain on a Tuesday night when the front doors swung open and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Sebastian Rocco had arrived. Even if you didn't follow the police blotters or the whispered rumors in the back alleys of Cook County, you knew who Sebastian was. He was the head of the Rocco family, a syndicate with tendrils wrapped tightly around the city's shipping, construction, and less legal imports. Sebastian was 32, ruthlessly handsome, and carried an aura of absolute terrifying authority. Tonight, however, he wasn't here for a sit-down with a rival. He was here for a rare public dinner with his children. Walking closely beside him, flanked by 3 massive bodyguards, were the triplets, Leo, Matteo, and Luca. They were 6 years old, dressed in immaculate miniature suits, their dark hair neatly parted. But it was their faces that made Alice's heart ache. They looked like porcelain dolls, beautiful but entirely hollow. Their eyes, wide and dark, stared straight ahead, registering everything but reacting to nothing. Every staff member at Lombardi's knew the tragic, bloody history. 3 years ago, at the Rocco estate in Lake Forest, a breach in security had led to a massacre. Sebastian's wife, Camilla, had been murdered in her bedroom. The triplets, then only 3 years old, had been found hiding inside a walk-in cedar closet, covered in their mother's blood. Since that night, not a single one of the boys had uttered a word. The trauma had locked their voices away behind an impenetrable wall of shock. Sebastian had flown in pediatric psychiatrists from Johns Hopkins in Switzerland, but the boys remained entirely, unbrokenly silent. Alice watched from the wait station as the family was seated at the private corner booth, shielded from the rest of the dining room by heavy velvet curtains. The maitre d' was sweating profusely as he handed off the table's ticket to Alice. "Don't mess this up, Alice," he hissed, wiping his brow. "Mr. Rocco's regular server called out sick. You do exactly what they ask. No delays." Alice swallowed hard, smoothing her apron. "Got it." As she approached the table to pour the sparkling water, the heavy silence of the booth hit her like a physical weight. Sebastian sat at the head of the table, nursing a neat bourbon, his jaw set, his eyes staring a hole through the white linen tablecloth. He looked like a man carrying the weight of a rotting empire. The 3 boys sat in a row opposite him. They didn't fidget. They didn't play with the silverware. They just sat, completely motionless. "Good evening, Mr. Rocco," Alice murmured softly, pouring the water. "Can I bring the boys anything to drink? Milk? Juice?" Sebastian didn't look at her. "Apple juice. 3. His voice was a low, gravelly baritone that left no room for conversation. "Right away, sir." Throughout the meal, Alice moved like a ghost. She served the bone-in ribeyes, the truffle mash, the roasted asparagus. But she couldn't stop looking at the boys. Matteo, the one sitting in the middle, had a small tremor in his left hand. Luca, on the right, kept staring at a dark stain on the oak wainscoting near the floor, his breathing shallow. Leo, the oldest by 3 minutes, simply stared at his untouched food. They weren't just quiet, they were terrified. Alice recognized that specific, suffocating brand of fear. It was the same fear she had felt when she was a little girl, hiding under the floorboards of a rotting Pilsen apartment, while her father, Arthur, paced above, clutching a shotgun, muttering about the shadow men coming to collect his debts. Her father had been a cleaner, a man who scrubbed blood out of carpets and disposed of messy evidence for low-level gangs. He was a paranoid, broken man, but he loved Alice. Whenever she had night terrors, shaking uncontrollably, her father would take a piece of chalk and draw a very specific symbol on the back of her bedroom door. "It's a ward, little bird," her father used to whisper, his breath smelling of cheap whiskey and bleach. "The twisted rose and the broken moon. The monsters see this, and they know to turn back. It keeps the bad men away." Alice didn't believe in magic anymore. Her father had died of a sudden, mysterious heart attack when she was 19, leaving her with nothing but debts and a profound understanding of the city's dark underbelly. But looking at the trembling hands of those 3 little boys, Alice felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of maternal empathy. They were drowning in their own minds. She wanted to give them just a second of comfort, a moment of peace. When Sebastian stepped out of the booth to take an urgent phone call, leaving the boys under the watchful eyes of a bodyguard named Vincent, Alice saw her opening. It was time for dessert. In the stainless steel prep area of the kitchen, Alice plated 3 orders of Lombardi's signature ricotta cannolis. Normally, the protocol was a simple dusting of powdered sugar. But Alice hesitated, her hand hovering over a squeeze bottle of dark, rich chocolate ganache. She thought of her father. She thought of the fear in little Matteo's eyes. Just a silly drawing, she told herself. Just something to distract them. With a steady hand, Alice gripped the plastic bottle. On the wide, white ceramic rim of each plate, she drew her father's ward. She started with a sharp, jagged crescent moon, the points unnaturally elongated. Then, wrapping through the center of the moon, she drew a rose, but not a soft, blooming one. It was a dying rose, the stem heavily armored with sharp, exaggerated thorns, the petals drooping downward like teardrops. It took her less than 10 seconds per plate. It was a precise, bizarre image, stark and dark against the pristine white porcelain. Balancing the tray, she pushed through the swinging kitchen doors and made her way back to the Rocco booth. Sebastian was still pacing in the hallway, his voice a low, angry murmur into his cell phone. The bodyguard, Vincent, stood a few feet away, arms crossed, his eyes scanning the room. Alice approached the table. The boys hadn't moved an inch. "Dessert," Alice said softly, setting the plates down carefully in front of each boy. "Cannolis." She took a step back, expecting them to ignore the food, just as they had the steaks. Leo, the oldest, lowered his gaze to the plate. For a second, nothing happened. Then, his eyes locked onto the chocolate drawing on the rim. Alice watched as the boy's pupils dilated. His breath hitched, a sharp, ragged sound that cut through the low hum of the restaurant. He reached out, his tiny, trembling fingers hovering just millimeters above the chocolate rose. Matteo and Luca leaned in, their eyes widening as they saw the symbols on their own plates. Suddenly, Luca grabbed his brother's sleeve, tugging it frantically. Matteo's chest began to heave. "Hey," the bodyguard, Vincent, stepped forward, his hand instinctively resting on the holster beneath his jacket. "What's wrong with them? What did you give them?" "Nothing," Alice said, panic rising in her throat. "It's just dessert." Leo's head snapped up. He wasn't looking at the plate anymore. He was staring dead at Alice. His brown eyes, previously empty, were now burning with an intense, desperate light. He opened his mouth. His jaw trembled. He struggled, his vocal cords fighting against 3 years of atrophy. Then, differist. A sound came out. A raspy, broken whisper. The door. Alice froze. The tray in her hands rattled. Vincent, the 250-pound enforcer, went completely rigid, the color draining from his face. Did he just speak? Matteo grabbed his own hair, staring at the chocolate symbol, and suddenly screamed. It wasn't a child's tantrum scream, it was a blood-curdling shriek of pure terror. The man with the thorns! He's at the door! Luca, the youngest, began crying hysterically, pointing a shaking finger at the plate, then pointing at Alice. He hurt Mommy. The Moon Man hurt Mommy. Chaos erupted. Vincent lunged forward, not toward Alice, but to shield the boys. The noise of Matteo's screaming ripped through the velvet curtains. Within seconds, Sebastian Rocco tore through the drapery, his phone clattering to the floor. What happened? Who touched them? Boss! Vincent yelled over the crying. They're talking! Leo and Matteo, they just spoke! Sebastian stopped dead. Time seemed to suspend. He stared at his sons, who were now clinging to each other, sobbing and gasping, their voices filling the air with fragmented, terrifying sentences. The thorns on the door. Leo wept, burying his face in his hands. He locked us in. Sebastian's breathing turned ragged. He fell to his knees in front of his sons, tears instantly welling in his fierce, dark eyes. Leo, Luca, it's me. It's Papa. Talk to me, amore mio. But the boys weren't looking at their father. They were pointing at the plates. Sebastian's gaze shifted to the table. He saw the white porcelain. He saw the chocolate ganache. He saw the jagged crescent moon intertwined with a thorny rose. When Sebastian Rocco looked back up, the tears were gone. The look in his eyes was one of pure, unadulterated murder. The temperature in the room plummeted. He stood up slowly, never taking his eyes off the chocolate sigil. Then, his head turned, his gaze locking onto Alice, who was backed up against the wood paneling, trembling like a leaf. Who drew this? Sebastian's voice was barely a whisper, yet it sounded like thunder. I did, Alice stammered. It's just a drawing. I thought it would. Sebastian moved faster than a man his size should be able to. Before Alice could blink, his hand shot out, grabbing her tightly by the throat of her apron, yanking her forward. Clear the restaurant, Sebastian roared to Vincent, his voice shaking the crystal chandeliers above. Lock the doors, take the boys to the armored car, and bring her to the back office. Now. The manager's office at Lombardi's was a windowless, cramped room, smelling of stale coffee and old receipt paper. Alice was thrown into a hard, wooden chair, her shoulder colliding painfully with a filing cabinet. The door slammed shut behind her, the lock clicking with terrifying finality. She sat in the dim light, hyperventilating. She had just triggered the children of the most dangerous man in Dakota. She was going to die in this room. They were going to make her disappear, just like the bodies her father used to clean up. 10 minutes passed in agonizing silence before the door opened. Sebastian Rocco stepped inside. He had shed his suit jacket, rolling up the sleeves of his black dress shirt. He locked the door behind him and pulled up a chair directly opposite Alice. He leaned forward, so close she could smell the expensive bourbon and the sharp tang of adrenaline on his breath. My sons haven't spoken a word in exactly 1,112 days, Sebastian said, his voice dangerously soft. The top neurologists in the world told me their brains had built a wall to protect them from what they saw the night my wife was murdered. Yet, you serve them a cannoli, and suddenly they are screaming about the man at the door. I swear to God, Mr. Rocco, I didn't mean any harm, Alice choked out, tears spilling down her cheeks. It was just a stupid drawing. A fairy tale. Sebastian reached into his back pocket. He pulled out a sleek smartphone, tapped the screen a few times, and held it up to Alice's face. Look at it, he commanded. Alice forced her eyes to focus on the screen. It was a photograph, clearly taken by a police forensic team. It showed a massive, splintered mahogany door, heavily stained with dark, dried blood. But right in the center of the wood, carved deeply and violently into the grain with a hunting knife, was a symbol. A jagged crescent moon, pierced by a drooping, thorny rose. Alice's breath hitched. It was an exact, flawless match to the chocolate drawing, down to the unnatural curve of the moon and the specific number of thorns. The police never released this photo, Sebastian said, his eyes scanning every micro-expression on Alice's pale face. My men scrubbed the CPD database. The only people who know about this symbol are me, the lead detective who investigated the scene, and the man who slaughtered my wife. Sebastian leaned closer, his dark eyes boring into her soul. So, I'm going to ask you one time, Alice. And if you lie to me, I will have Vincent take you to a warehouse by the river, and you will never see the sun again. Who are you working for? Who told you to draw the assassin's calling card on my children's plates? No one, Alice sobbed, pressing herself back into the hard chair. I swear, I don't know any assassins. I just work here. Sebastian pulled a silver switchblade from his pocket, snapping the blade open with a sharp clack. He drove the point of the knife into the wooden desk between them. Don't play games with me. The boys called him the Moon Man. The killer carved this into the bedroom door before he executed Camilla, locking the boys in the closet to watch through the slats. How do you know the mark of the syndicate's ghost? It's a ward, Alice screamed, desperate, her mind flashing back to the rotting apartment in Pilsen. It's supposed to keep monsters away. My father taught it to me. Sebastian froze. The anger in his eyes flickered, replaced by a sudden, sharp confusion. Your father? Arthur. Alice gasped, struggling to catch her breath. Arthur Jenkins. He died 5 years ago. He was a cleaner. He cleaned up crime scenes. When I was little, I had night terrors. He used to draw that exact symbol on my door with chalk. He told me it was a ward to keep the bad men away. Sebastian stared at her in silence. The heavy ticking of the wall clock seemed to echo like gunshots. Arthur Jenkins. Sebastian repeated the name slowly, tasting the syllables. He pulled out his phone again and dialed a number. Silvio, run a name for me. Arthur Jenkins. Deceased. Roughly 5 years ago. Find out who he worked for, who paid his bills, and pull his entire file from the Cook County archives. I want it in 10 minutes. He hung up and looked back at Alice. The pure murderous rage had morphed into a cold, calculating intensity. If your father was a cleaner, Sebastian said softly, piecing the puzzle together in real time, he wasn't drawing a fairy tale ward on your door, Alice. Cleaners don't believe in magic. They believe in warnings. Alice felt a chill run down her spine. What are you saying? I'm saying, Sebastian leaned back, staring at her as if seeing her for the first time, that your father recognized the mark of a highly specialized hitman. A hitman so terrifying that your father used his symbol to mark his own territory, hoping it would scare off lower-level thugs, which means your father didn't just clean up gang violence, Alice. He cleaned up messes for the big leagues. And he knew exactly who killed my wife. Before Alice could process the gravity of his words, Sebastian's phone buzzed. He looked at the screen, and his jaw tightened. Well, Sebastian murmured, standing up and sliding the switchblade back into his pocket. It seems your story checks out, Alice, but it also presents a massive problem. What problem? Alice asked, her voice trembling. Silvio just pulled your father's old employment records from a shell company, Sebastian said, his eyes darkening. Your father, Arthur Jenkins, didn't work for street gangs. He was on the payroll of the Genovese family in New York, my family's oldest, deadliest rivals. And the man who approved his paychecks was the same man I've suspected of ordering the hit on my wife. Sebastian stepped toward her, towering over the small chair. You aren't just a waitress anymore, Alice. You are the daughter of the only man who knew the identity of the ghost who destroyed my family. You know the symbol. You've seen the killer's work. Please, Alice whispered, terrified of the shifting dynamic. I don't know anything. Just let me go. I can't do that, Sebastian said, his voice dropping to a smooth, dangerous register. The moment you drew that symbol in my restaurant, my men weren't the only ones who saw it. There are eyes everywhere in this city. If the Genovese family finds out Arthur Jenkins' daughter is walking around with knowledge of their ghost's calling card, you won't survive the night. He reached down, grabbing her arm and pulling her to her feet with surprising gentleness, though his grip was like iron. You're coming with me, the Mafia boss stated, leaving absolutely no room for debate. You made my son speak. Now, you're going to help me find the monster who silenced them. Welcome to the family, Alice. The ride from the heart of Dakota to the affluent, heavily wooded suburbs of Lake Forest was a blur of rain-slicked asphalt and suffocating silence. Alice sat in the back of a heavily armored Cadillac Escalade V-Series, the tinted, bullet-resistant glass separating her from the neon glow of the city she was rapidly leaving behind. Beside her sat Sebastian Rocco, an immovable mountain of tailored wool and suppressed violence. In the third row, the triplets Leo, Matteo, and Luca were huddled together under a cashmere blanket, their breathing finally evening out after the hysterical breakdown at the restaurant. Vincent, the massive bodyguard, drove with white-knuckled precision, his eyes constantly darting to the rearview mirror. Where exactly are we going? Alice finally dared to ask, her voice barely rising above the hum of the SUV's heavy engine. She gripped the fabric of her cheap waitress apron, suddenly acutely aware of how out of place she was. My home, Sebastian replied, not turning his head. He was staring out the window, his jaw clenched so tightly she could see a muscle feathering beneath his skin. The estate is the only place in Cook County where I can guarantee your safety. And right now, Alice, your safety is paramount to my family's survival. I don't even know your family, Alice protested, a fresh wave of panic tightening her chest. "Mr. Rocco, I'm nobody. My dad was a janitor who drank too much and left me with $20,000 in medical debt at Northwestern Memorial. He wasn't a mob cleaner." Sebastian turned slowly, his dark, calculating eyes locking onto hers. "Ordinary janitors don't use the Genovese family's premier assassin's calling card to ward off night terrors. Your father, Arthur, hid in plain sight. And whatever he knew, whatever he documented, is the key to finding the man who slaughtered Camilla and broke my son's minds." He leaned in closer, the scent of bergamot and expensive bourbon washing over her. "You are in this now. There is no going back to Lombardi's. There is no going back to your cramped apartment in Pilsen. My men have already packed your belongings. Your landlord has been paid off for the rest of the year. To the rest of the world, Alice Jenkins has simply gone on an extended vacation." Alice's breath caught in her throat. She was a hostage, a gilded, protected hostage, but a captive nonetheless. 30 minutes later, the Escalade turned off a private, winding road and approached a set of massive wrought iron gates. Vincent rolled down his window, pressing his thumb to a biometric scanner mounted on a stone pillar. The heavy gates swung open smoothly, revealing the Rocco estate. It wasn't just a house, it was a fortress masquerading as a modern architectural masterpiece. Set on 10 acres of prime lakefront property, the mansion was a sprawling structure of dark stone, floor-to-ceiling reinforced glass, and sharp, imposing angles. Alice could see men in dark jackets patrolling the perimeter with Malinois guard dogs on heavy chain leashes. As they pulled into the subterranean garage, Sebastian finally spoke to the boys. "Come, ragazzi, we are home." The triplets unbuckled their seatbelts, but they didn't move toward their father. Instead, little Leo, the one who had broken his silence, reached out and grabbed a fistful of Alice's apron. Matteo and Luca immediately followed suit, clinging to her sides. Vincent stopped, looking at his boss with wide eyes. Sebastian froze, his hand resting on the open car door. They want you," Sebastian said, his voice carrying a strange mixture of jealousy, shock, and profound relief. "Don't let go of them." Alice swallowed hard, her maternal instincts completely overriding her fear of the Mafia boss. She gently placed her hands on the boy's small shoulders. "It's okay, I've got you. Let's go inside." The interior of the house was a masterclass in cold, minimalist luxury. Italian marble floors, vaulted ceilings, and priceless abstract art, but it felt devoid of warmth. It felt like a museum where someone had died. Sebastian led them upstairs to the children's wing. A stern-faced nanny named Maria was waiting, but the moment she tried to usher the boys into the bathroom to wash up, Matteo began to hyperventilate, his eyes darting frantically to the heavy oak doors. He pointed a trembling finger at the wood, looking at Alice. "The thorns," Matteo whispered, his voice raspy and unused. "Don't let the thorns in." Alice fell to her knees, pulling the boy into a tight hug. "I won't," she promised fiercely. "I know the ward. I know how to keep him out." Sebastian watched from the doorway, his chest rising and falling heavily. He dismissed Maria with a sharp nod. "Give them whatever they need, Alice, please." It was the first time she had heard the ruthless Sebastian Rocco use the word please. For the next 2 hours, Alice sat on the edge of the massive king-sized bed they shared. She asked Vincent for a dark washable marker. With Sebastian watching her every move, she went to the bedroom door and drew the twisted crescent moon and the drooping, heavily armored rose right in the center of the wood. The twisted rose and the broken moon. The monsters see this, and they know to turn back. Alice recited the words her father had told her, her voice trembling slightly. The boys watched the door, their breathing slowing. One by one, their eyes drooped closed. For the first time in years, they fell asleep without the aid of heavy prescription sedatives. Alice stood up slowly, her joints aching. She walked out into the hallway, where Sebastian was leaning against the wall, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. "My study," he ordered softly. "We need to talk." Days bled into a week at the Lake Forest estate. Alice was given a guest suite that was larger than her entire apartment, outfitted with a wardrobe of understated, expensive clothing, cashmere sweaters, silk blouses, and soft wool trousers. She was treated with terrifying respect by the staff and the armed guards, but she was never left alone. Her days were spent with the triplets. Dr. Aris Kensington, a renowned pediatric psychiatrist from Northwestern, was brought in daily. Dr. Kensington was astounded by the progress. It's textbook associative anchoring, Dr. Kensington explained to Sebastian in the library one afternoon, while Alice sat on the floor playing a silent game of chess with Leo. The boys linked the trauma of their mother's death to that specific symbol carved on the door. When Alice reproduced it and reframed it as a protective ward rather than a mark of death, it broke the mental dam. They are speaking, Sebastian. In fragments, yes, but the neural pathways are firing. Sebastian stared at Alice from across the room, his expression unreadable. What did they tell her today? Alice looked up from the chessboard. Matteo said something about a ring. He said the Moon Man wore a heavy silver ring that clicked against the doorknob when he locked them in the closet. A ring with a flat black stone. Sebastian's jaw set. A black onyx signet. That's a traditional piece for made men in the Genovese ranks. He turned to Dr. Kensington. Thank you, doctor. Vincent will see you out. Once the doctor was gone, Sebastian crossed the room, stopping just inches from Alice. The physical proximity of him was always overwhelming. He radiated heat and absolute control. You're good with them, Sebastian said softly, looking down at his sons, who were now engrossed in a puzzle. They're good boys, Alice replied, refusing to back down from his intense gaze. They just needed someone who understood what it feels like to be terrified of the dark. And your father? Sebastian asked. His voice dropping to a low murmur meant only for her. Did he understand? I'm starting to realize I didn't know my father at all, Alice admitted, a bitter edge to her voice. If he was taking blood money from New York mobsters, he hid it well. We lived on expired canned soup and generic antibiotics. Cleaners are paid in cash and silence, Alice. They don't flash their wealth because wealth draws attention. Sebastian reached out, his large calloused hand gently brushing a stray lock of hair behind her ear. The touch was electric, sending a jolt straight down her spine. My men have been tearing apart the city, looking for Arthur Jenkins' ghost. But the trail is cold. Before Alice could process the intimacy of his touch, the heavy oak doors of the library slammed open. Vincent stood there, breathing heavily, carrying a medium-sized cardboard box. The normally stoic bodyguard looked visibly pale. Boss, this just came through the perimeter gate. A courier dropped it off and sped away. The plates on the bike were stolen. Sebastian's demeanor instantly snapped from a man in a quiet, intimate moment to a predator. He stepped in front of Alice, shielding her with his body. Did security scan it? Explosive sweep is clear, Vincent said grimly. But you need to see this. Sebastian approached the box. He pulled on a pair of black leather gloves from his pocket and carefully lifted the flaps. Alice peeked around his broad shoulder. Inside the box, resting on a bed of black velvet, was a single, long-stemmed white rose, but it was dead, its petals withered and brittle. Tied to the heavily thorned stem, with a piece of wire, was a small white card. Sebastian picked up the card. Written in dark, rust-colored ink, which Alice immediately realized was dried blood, was a single crescent moon. Underneath it, in elegant script, "Tell Arthur's little bird she shouldn't play with chalk. We are coming to collect our debts, Sebastian." Alice gasped, taking a stumbling step backward. How? How do they know I'm here? Because there is a rat in my house, Sebastian roared, slamming the box onto the mahogany desk, the sound echoing like a gunshot. The triplets jumped, whimpering in fear. Sebastian instantly closed his eyes, taking a deep, ragged breath to rein in his fury. He turned to Alice, his chest heaving. Take the boys to the panic room in the sub-basement. Now. Sebastian, go, he commanded. Alice grabbed the boys' hands, rushing them out of the library. As she hurried down the corridor, she looked back. Sebastian was issuing rapid-fire orders to Vincent, his face a mask of lethal intent. The war hadn't just reached Dakota, it had walked right through the front door. Later that night, long after the estate had been locked down into a fortress of steel shutters and armed patrols, Sebastian found Alice in the sub-basement. The panic room was built like a luxury bunker, complete with beds, a kitchenette, and its own ventilation system. The boys were finally asleep. Alice sat at the small table, her head in her hands, trembling violently. Sebastian walked in, shedding his suit jacket. He looked exhausted, the weight of the underworld pressing heavily on his shoulders. He pulled out a chair and sat next to her. "I'm sorry I yelled," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. "They're going to kill me," Alice whispered, fresh tears spilling over her lashes. "Whoever this Moon Man is, he knows I'm here. He knows I know his mark. Look at me, Sebastian demanded softly. He reached out, cupping her face in his hands, forcing her to meet his dark, burning eyes. No one is going to touch you. Do you understand? You are under my protection. You gave my sons their voices back. I would burn this entire city to the ground before I let a single thorn scratch your skin. The intensity in his eyes was intoxicating. In the sterile, terrifying confines of the panic room, the space between them seemed to vanish. Alice felt herself leaning in, drawn by the undeniable, magnetic pull of the man who ruled an empire, but fell to his knees for his children. Sebastian's gaze dropped to her lips. His thumbs gently stroked her cheekbones. For a fleeting, breathless second, Alice thought he was going to kiss her. But then, his phone buzzed in his pocket, shattering the fragile moment. Sebastian pulled back, clearing his throat, though his eyes never left hers. He answered the phone. "What is it, Silvio?" He listened for a moment, his jaw tightening. "Are you absolutely certain?" He paused. "Print it out. Have the Escalade ready in 10 minutes. Sebastian hung up and stood. His demeanor completely shifted back to business. "Alice," he said, pulling his jacket back on. "Silvio just found something buried deep in your father's old tax records. A recurring payment for a private safety deposit box at a Chase Bank branch in the Loop. The rental fee was paid up for 10 years right before he died." Alice stood up, her heart hammering. "A safety deposit box? He never told me about that." "Cleaners don't write memoirs," Sebastian said grimly. "They keep ledgers. If your father knew who the Moon Man was, the proof is in that box. We are leaving right now." The financial district of Dakota, known as the Loop, was eerily quiet at 2 in the morning. The towering skyscrapers of glass and steel formed deep, dark canyons. The rain had intensified, washing the empty streets in a slick, oily sheen. Sebastian and Alice, flanked by Vincent and 2 other heavily armed men, entered the massive Chase Bank building through a private secured side entrance. Sebastian had called in a massive favor with a corrupt bank executive to bypass the daytime security protocols. The vault in the sub-basement was vast, filled with thousands of steel rectangular doors. The air smelled of old metal, dust, and secrets. A nervous bank manager, wearing a hastily thrown-on trench coat over his pajamas, used his master key while Alice produced the small, brass key she had found years ago in her father's shaving kit, a key she had assumed belonged to an old padlock. The lock clicked. The manager pulled out a long, heavy metal box. "I'll leave you to it, Mr. Rocco," the manager stammered, practically running out of the vault. Vincent and the guards stood by the heavy steel doors, their hands resting on the grips of their weapons. Sebastian placed the box on a viewing table under the harsh fluorescent lights. "Open it," he told Alice. With shaking hands, Alice lifted the lid. Inside, there was no money, no gold bars. Instead, the box contained a meticulously organized collection of horrors. Asterisk. A black leather ledger, filled with dates, locations, and names. Alice recognized some of the street names. They were sites of infamous, unsolved gangland murders over the past decade. Next to each date was a payment amount and the initials CR. Asterisk. A burner phone. Ancient and dead. Likely holding a single, heavily encrypted number. Asterisk. A manila envelope, thick and sealed with wax. Sebastian picked up the ledger, his eyes scanning the pages. He documented every crime scene he scrubbed. He was keeping insurance. He flipped to the very last entry, dated 3 years ago, the exact date Camilla Rocco was murdered. The entry read, Lake Forest, high profile, double rate, target eliminated, collateral damage avoided, mark left per protocol, the viper sheds his skin. The viper, Sebastian hissed, the color draining from his face. Carmine the Viper Roselli, the underboss of the Genovese family. He's the one who authorized the hits. But who pulled the trigger? Alice asked, picking up the manila envelope. She broke the wax seal and slid out the contents. It was a stack of 8x10 glossy photographs, surveillance photos. Alice flipped through them. They showed a man in a dark trench coat meeting with various known Mafia figures in dimly lit alleys and parking garages. The man's face was always obscured by shadows or a low-pulled hat. "These don't show his face," Alice said, frustration leaking into her voice. "Keep looking," Sebastian commanded, his eyes still glued to the ledger. Alice reached the final photograph in the stack. It was taken indoors, seemingly through a window. The flash illuminated a man sitting at a table, counting stacks of $100 bills. His head was turned slightly, revealing his profile. But it wasn't his face that made Alice's blood turn to ice. It was his hand, resting on the money. On his right ring finger was a heavy silver signet ring with a flat black onyx stone. And extending from beneath his shirt cuff, snaking up the side of his neck, was a highly distinctive, jagged tattoo of a thorny rose. Alice gasped, dropping the photo onto the metal table. Sebastian snapped his head up. He looked at the photo. For 10 agonizing seconds, the air in the vault seemed to completely vanish. Sebastian's expression didn't change to anger. It changed to absolute, hollow devastation. "No," Sebastian whispered, stumbling back a step. "No, that's impossible." Alice looked from the photo to Sebastian. "Do you know him?" "Know him?" Sebastian's voice cracked. A horrifying sound of a man's soul tearing in half. "He grew up in my house. He ate at my table. He swore a blood oath to my father." Alice looked at the photo again, then slowly raised her eyes, looking past Sebastian toward the heavy steel doors of the vault. Standing there, his gun drawn and aimed directly at Sebastian's back, was Silvio, Sebastian's right-hand man, the man who had been running the intelligence on Arthur Jenkins, the man who had told them exactly where to find this box. Silvio's face was devoid of emotion. As he shifted his grip on his suppressed Glock, his cuff rode up, revealing the dark, twisted ink of a thorny rose on his wrist. "You always were too smart for your own good, Dom," Silvio said, his voice echoing coldly in the vault. "Carmine sends his regards. It's time to finish the job." Before Silvio could pull the trigger, the vault erupted into chaos. Vincent, realizing the betrayal a split second too late, lunged forward with a roar. Silvio's gun coughed twice, quiet, deadly spits of compressed air. Vincent grunted, a bloom of red exploding on his shoulder, throwing his massive frame into the metal safety deposit boxes with a deafening crash. Sebastian didn't hesitate. With terrifying speed, he grabbed the metal table and flipped it upwards, shoving Alice violently behind the heavy steel barrier just as a volley of bullets sparked against the metal, deafening them in the enclosed space. "Stay down," Sebastian roared, pulling his own weapon from his shoulder holster. The air filled with the acrid smell of cordite and the screams of ricocheting bullets. Alice curled into a tight ball on the cold floor, clutching the photograph to her chest, her hands slick with a cold sweat. The monster wasn't a ghost in New York. He had been standing beside them the entire time. The acoustics of the Chase Bank vault turned the suppressed gunshots into a deafening, rhythmic series of cracks that reverberated off the thousands of steel deposit boxes. Alice was curled so tightly into a ball behind the overturned viewing table that her muscles cramped, her hands clamped fiercely over her ears. The smell of cordite and pulverized concrete flooded the sterile, chilled air. Sebastian was a shadow of lethal motion. The moment the table had flipped, he had drawn his customized Glock 19. He didn't fire blindly. He fired with the cold, calculated precision of a man who had been bred for war. Two of the guards who had accompanied them into the vault, men Sebastian had trusted, men who had eaten at his table, suddenly turned their weapons on him. Silvio had bought them out. Crack, crack. Sebastian dropped the first traitor with a double tap to the chest, the guard's body slamming backward into the wall of lockboxes. The second guard managed to squeeze off a wild burst from his submachine gun, chewing through the thick steel of the table just inches from Alice's head. Showered in sparks and metal shavings, she screamed, clutching her father's ledger against her chest. From the corner of the room, Vincent roared. The massive bodyguard, clutching his bleeding, shattered shoulder, didn't reach for his gun. He relied on pure, unadulterated brute force. He lunged like a wounded bear, tackling the second rogue guard around the waist. The two men crashed to the polished concrete floor in a tangle of limbs and tactical gear. Vincent ignored the pain of his gunshot wound, wrapping his massive hands around the traitor's neck and squeezing until the man went limp. Silvio, the Moon Man, was too smart to stay exposed. He had already retreated to the heavy steel doorway of the vault, using the foot-thick frame as cover. "You're losing your touch, Dom," Silvio yelled over the ringing silence that followed the initial burst of gunfire. "You brought a waitress to do a cleaner's job." "Carmine offered me a seat at the Genovese table. All I had to do was erase your bloodline." "You're a dead man, Silvio." Sebastian's voice was a terrifying, guttural snarl. He checked his magazine, his dark eyes burning with a rage so profound it seemed to suck the oxygen out of the room. You looked my children in the eye every day, knowing you slaughtered their mother. It's business. It's always been business. Silvio fired 3 rapid shots, the bullets pinging viciously off the edge of the overturned table. The boys were collateral. But don't worry, I left a crew at the Lake Forest estate. By the time you bleed out in this basement, your little silent heirs won't have to worry about the dark anymore. Alice's heart stopped. The blood froze in her veins. The boys, Leo, Matteo, Luca. They were asleep in the panic room, guarded by men who might just be as corrupt as Silvio. No, Alice breathed. The terror that had paralyzed her suddenly evaporated, replaced by a searing, blinding surge of adrenaline. They couldn't die. She wouldn't let those 3 little boys face the monster in the dark alone. She looked down at her feet. The heavy metal lockbox from her father's deposit box had fallen to the floor, its lid open, spilling the burner phone and the wax envelope. Alice grabbed the solid steel box. It weighed at least 10 pounds. "Sebastian," Alice whispered fiercely, grabbing his pant leg. He glanced down, his eyes wide with surprise at the absolute lack of fear in her face. "When I throw this, you shoot him. Don't miss." Before Sebastian could protest, Alice vaulted upright from behind the table. With a scream that tore from the very bottom of her lungs, she hurled the heavy steel box across the vault with everything she had. Silvio, expecting return fire from Sebastian, stepped out to take a shot, only to see a 10-pound block of steel hurtling toward his face. He flinched, raising his arms to protect himself. The box collided violently with his wrist, knocking the suppressed pistol from his grip. In that microsecond of distraction, Sebastian stood up. He didn't hesitate. He fired a single shot. The bullet tore through Silvio's thigh. The traitor howled in agony, his leg buckling beneath him. But Silvio was a professional survivor. Instead of reaching for his dropped weapon, he threw his weight backward, rolling through the vault threshold and slamming his bloody hand against the emergency lockdown button on the wall. The massive 2-ton steel vault door began to swing shut, heavy alarm klaxons instantly wailing to life. "Move!" Sebastian roared, grabbing Alice by the waist and hoisting her off her feet. He sprinted for the shrinking gap, dragging Vincent by his good arm. They dove through the opening, just as the massive steel door slammed shut behind them, with a final, echoing boom, sealing the dead guards inside. Silvio, however, was already gone, leaving a smear of blood trailing toward the VIP elevator. He locked the elevator, Vincent gasped, clutching his bleeding shoulder, his face gray and slick with sweat. "The emergency stairs," Sebastian ordered, his chest heaving. He turned to Alice, his eyes scanning her intensely for any injuries. "Are you hit?" "I'm fine," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. She held up her father's black ledger. "I have it." "But Sebastian, the boys." "I know." Sebastian's jaw tightened into a rigid line. He pulled his phone from his pocket, dialing a number as they sprinted toward the stairwell. "Enzo. It's Dom. Silvio is the rat. He's the Moon Man. Execute Protocol Omega at the estate right now. Lock down the kids." Sebastian listened for a second, the color completely drained from his face. He lowered the phone. Enzo is dead. The Genovese hit squad breached the perimeter 5 minutes ago. The drive from the loop back to the northern suburbs was a suicide run. Vincent, bleeding out over the leather seats, refused to sit in the back. He drove the armored Cadillac Escalade V-Series with one hand, pushing the massive SUV to 120 miles per hour down the rain-slicked concrete of Lower Wacker Drive, running every red light and ignoring the blaring horns of early morning commercial trucks. In the back seat, Sebastian was a man possessed. He had stripped off his blood-spattered suit jacket and was currently locking a fresh magazine into an imported Sig Sauer MCX assault rifle he kept stashed in a hidden compartment under the floorboards. Alice sat beside him, tearing the hem of her expensive silk blouse to fashion a makeshift tourniquet for Vincent's shoulder. Her hands were covered in the bodyguard's blood, but her mind was completely hyper-focused. "The panic room," Alice said, her voice cutting through the roar of the V8 engine. "It's reinforced. Even if they breach the house, they can't get through those titanium doors." "Silvio was my second in command," Sebastian said, his voice terrifyingly calm, the calm of a man who had accepted that he was going to war. "He knows the override codes." He knows the blind spots in the security cameras. He knows exactly how to crack that room open. Sebastian turned to her, his dark eyes locking onto hers. In the dim, flashing streetlights passing over the tinted windows, he looked like a dark god of vengeance. When we get there, it is going to be a slaughterhouse. I am going to draw their fire. You are going to take the service tunnels beneath the wine cellar. They lead directly to the sub-basement behind the panic room. He reached into his waistband, pulled out a sleek, compact Beretta, and pressed it firmly into Alice's hands. I don't know how to shoot, Alice stammered, staring at the matte black weapon. You don't need to be a marksman, Sebastian said, placing his large hands over hers, forcing her fingers around the grip. Point it at the center of their chest and pull the trigger until it clicks. Do not hesitate, Alice. They will not show you mercy. You are a Rocco now. You protect our own. You are a Rocco now. The words echoed in her head. A week ago, she was pouring tap water for aldermen and trying to avoid eviction. Now, the most powerful man in Dakota was placing the survival of his bloodline in her hands. She gripped the cold metal of the gun. I won't let them touch the boys. 10 minutes later, the Escalade skidded off the private road and approached the estate. The wrought iron gates, usually a symbol of impenetrable security, had been blown off their hinges by C4 explosives. Smoke billowed into the dark, rainy sky. As they sped up the winding driveway, the headlights illuminated the absolute devastation. Bodies of Sebastian's loyal men lay strewn across the manicured lawns. The front oak doors of the mansion were splintered, and the sound of heavy automatic gunfire echoed from inside the house. Vincent, keep the engine running, Sebastian ordered as the SUV slammed to a halt behind a stone fountain. If we aren't out in 15 minutes, you drive away and you don't look back. Boss, do it! Sebastian roared. He kicked his door open, stepping out into the pouring rain. He didn't crouch or hide. He raised the Sig Sauer, let out a war cry that chilled Alice to the bone, and opened fire on the 2 Genovese soldiers standing guard on the front portico. They dropped instantly. Go, Alice, Sebastian yelled, laying down suppressing fire as more men spilled out of the front doors. The cellar! Alice didn't look back. She sprinted through the rain, slipping on the wet grass, clutching the Beretta tightly. She rounded the side of the massive stone house, finding the heavy wooden doors that led down into the subterranean wine cellars. She threw her weight against them, tumbling down the stone steps into the darkness. The cellar smelled of ancient oak and expensive Bordeaux. Above her, the floorboards shook as the firefight raged in the grand foyer. Sebastian was fighting an entire hit squad by himself. Alice moved quickly, navigating the maze of wine racks until she found the false wall disguised as a ventilation grate. She pressed the hidden latch Sebastian had told her about, and the panel swung open, revealing a narrow, concrete service tunnel. She crawled through the tight space, her knees scraping against the rough floor, the sounds of battle becoming muffled. After what felt like an eternity, the tunnel opened up into the sub-basement corridor, directly behind the panic room. The emergency lights were flashing a strobe-like red, and standing in front of the massive titanium door of the panic room were 2 men in tactical gear. One of them was plugging a decryption device into the electronic keypad. Hurry up, one of the men growled. Silvio said he wants the kids dealt with before he gets here. Alice hid behind a concrete pillar, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She raised the Beretta, her hands shaking so violently she could barely keep the sights aligned. Pointed at the center of their chest and pull the trigger until it clicks. She thought of Matteo's screaming night terrors. She thought of Luca's trembling hands. She thought of Leo, bravely whispering his first words in 3 years just to warn her of the danger. Alice stepped out from behind the pillar. The man with the decryption device turned around. What the? Alice closed her eyes and pulled the trigger. The Beretta bucked in her hand, the noise deafening in the enclosed concrete hallway. She kept pulling the trigger, blind and terrified. Bang, 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 bang. When the gun finally clicked empty, Alice opened her eyes, dropping the smoking weapon. Both men were on the floor, motionless. She choked back a sob and ran to the keypad. The decryption device had finished its cycle. The screen glowed green. Access granted. With a heavy hiss of hydraulics, the thick titanium door slid open. Alice rushed inside. Leo, Matteo, Luca. The boys were huddled under the stainless steel prep table in the corner of the room, clutching each other. When they saw her, their eyes widened in absolute shock and pure, unadulterated relief. "Alice!" Leo cried, his voice raspy but loud. He scrambled out from under the table, throwing his little arms around her waist. Matteo and Luca followed, burying their faces in her torn clothes, crying hysterically. "I've got you," Alice wept, dropping to her knees and wrapping her arms around all three of them. "I told you I'd keep the monsters away. I've got you." But her relief was shattered a second later by the sound of slow, heavy clapping echoing from the doorway. Alice looked up. Silvio stood in the threshold of the panic room. He was a horrific sight. His suit was torn, heavily stained with blood from the gunshot wound in his thigh. He leaned heavily against the titanium doorframe, breathing raggedly, but he held a heavy silver revolver in his hand, aimed directly at Alice's head. "Well, well, well," Silvio sneered, spitting a wad of bloody saliva onto the pristine floor of the bunker. "Arthur Jenkins' little girl, you actually pulled the trigger. I guess the apple doesn't fall far from the cleaner's tree." Alice immediately pushed the boys behind her, using her own body as a shield. She glanced at the empty Beretta lying by the doorway. She was completely unarmed. "It's over, Silvio," Alice said, trying to keep her voice steady, though she knew they were trapped. "Sebastian has the ledger. He knows Carmine ordered the hit. The entire commission will know by morning. You have nowhere to run." "I don't need to run," Silvio chuckled darkly, limping into the room. He raised his right hand, the hand holding the revolver. On his ring finger, the heavy silver signet ring with the flat black onyx stone glinted under the emergency lights. "Once I wipe out Rocco's bloodline, Carmine will make me the boss of Dakota. The commission only respects power, and power is taking everything your enemy loves." He cocked the hammer of the revolver. The mechanical click sounded like a death knell in the quiet room. "Mommy!" Luca screamed, burying his face in Alice's back. Silvio's eyes darkened with sick amusement. "Ah, the mute finally speaks. Just like your mother, begging at the end." Suddenly, little Leo let go of Alice's waist. Before she could stop him, the 6-year-old boy stepped out from behind her. He stood between Alice and the gun, his small hands balled into fists at his sides. He was terrified, tears streaming down his face, but he didn't look away from the man who had ruined his life. "You can't hurt us anymore," Leo said, his voice surprisingly clear, echoing with the undeniable authority of his father. "The ward is on the door. You can't come in." Silvio frowned, looking confused for a fraction of a second. "What ward?" "The one behind you." A voice as deep and cold as the grave rumbled from the hallway. Silvio spun around, raising his weapon, but he was far too slow. Sebastian Rocco was a horrifying vision of violence. His white shirt was soaked in blood, both his own and his enemies. He had discarded the rifle, and now held a wicked, serrated combat knife in his hand. Before Silvio could even squeeze the trigger, Sebastian closed the distance like a shadow. He grabbed Silvio's gun arm, twisting it upward with a sickening snap of bone. Silvio shrieked, the revolver clattering to the floor. Sebastian didn't stop. He drove his knee viciously into Silvio's already wounded thigh, dropping the traitor to the ground. "This is for my wife," Sebastian roared, slamming his fist into Silvio's face, shattering his nose in an explosion of blood. "This is for my sons," Sebastian snarled, hitting him again, cracking his jaw. Silvio gasped, choking on his own blood, desperately reaching for a backup weapon tucked in his ankle holster. But Sebastian saw the movement. With a swift, brutal motion, Sebastian drove the combat knife directly through Silvio's right hand, the hand bearing the black onyx ring, pinning it to the concrete floor. Silvio let out an agonizing, guttural scream that echoed through the sub-basement. Sebastian knelt over him, his chest heaving, his dark eyes devoid of any mercy. He grabbed Silvio by the throat, cutting off his screams. "Look at me," Sebastian whispered, his voice vibrating with lethal intent. "You drew a dead rose on my door. But you forgot one thing about a rose, Silvio." Sebastian leaned in, twisting the knife just a fraction of an inch, making the traitor thrash in unbearable agony. The thorns protect the family. With a final, devastating display of strength, Sebastian stood up, leaving the knife embedded in the concrete. Silvio's eyes rolled back, his body twitching once before going completely still. The Moon Man was finally dead. Sebastian stood over the body for a long moment, breathing heavily, the adrenaline slowly leaving his system. He looked exhausted, battered, and utterly broken. Then he turned around. He saw Alice, sitting on the floor, holding his 3 sons tightly against her chest. The boys weren't looking at the body, they were looking at their father. Sebastian dropped to his knees. The ruthless, untouchable Mafia boss completely shattered. Tears, heavy and uncontrolled, spilled down his bruised cheeks. He opened his arms. "Papa!" Leo cried out. Matteo and Luca echoed their brother, scrambling away from Alice and throwing themselves into their father's arms. Sebastian buried his face in their hair, weeping openly, holding them so tightly it seemed he was trying to press them back into his soul. For the first time in 3 years, the Lake Forest estate was filled with the sound of the Rocco children's voices. Alice watched them, tears streaming down her own face. She felt a profound sense of peace wash over her, but also a deep realization her part in this story was over. She had saved them. The ward had held. It was time for her to slip back into the shadows and let this family heal. She quietly stood up, intending to slip out the door while they held each other. But as she took a step backward, a large blood-stained hand shot out and gently wrapped around her wrist. Alice looked down. Sebastian was looking up at her, his dark eyes incredibly vulnerable, stripping away every wall he had ever built. "Don't," Sebastian whispered, his voice thick with emotion. He pulled her gently toward him, pulling her down to her knees until she was wrapped in the embrace of the man and his 3 sons. "Don't you ever leave us, Alice." Little Matteo reached out, his tiny hand gripping Alice's torn silk collar. "Stay," he murmured. Alice looked at the boys, and then into Sebastian's eyes. The connection between them was no longer born of fear or necessity. It was forged in fire, in blood, and in an undeniable, ferocious love. She wasn't a broke waitress anymore. She wasn't the traumatized daughter of a mafia cleaner. She was the woman who had broken the silence. She was the woman who had tamed the monsters. Alice leaned forward, resting her forehead against Sebastian's, closing her eyes. "I'm right here," she whispered softly. "I'm not going anywhere." The aftermath of the siege reshaped the Dakota underworld. With the ledger in Sebastian's possession, the Genovese family was forced into submission by the National Commission, turning Carmine Roselli over to Sebastian to face a brutal private justice. The war was won, decisively and violently. But inside the fortified walls of the Lake Forest estate, a different kind of life began. The heavy, suffocating silence was replaced by the chaotic, beautiful noise of 3 little boys learning how to laugh again. And standing at the center of it all, no longer a captive but the undisputed queen of the Rocco Empire, was Alice, the woman who proved that sometimes the only way to banish the darkness is to redraw the stars. And that is how a terrifying nightmare turned into a fierce, unbreakable mafia family. Alice risked absolutely everything, from dodging bullets in a subterranean bank vault to facing down the ultimate betrayer, all to protect 3 little boys who finally found their voices. Who would have thought that a simple chocolate drawing on a dessert plate would take down the most lethal assassin in the syndicate? If you loved the intense action, the jaw-dropping betrayals, and the undeniable romance between Sebastian and Alice, let us know. Did you guess that Silvio was the Moon Man all along? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Don't forget to smash that like button, share this incredible story with your friends, and hit subscribe so you never miss another thrilling high-stakes drama on our channel. Until next time, stay safe out there.